Hello friends, I have finally gotten around to making a video discussing the fellowship between trans people and autistic people. It's been inspired by two troubling events this month in the Anglo-American world. The first was Robert Kennedy's press conference, where he spewed enough misinformation and hate about autism to make Goebbels blush.
And these are kids who will never pay taxes, they'll never hold a job, they'll never play baseball, they'll never write a poem, they'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted.
And here in the UK, the Supreme Court ruled on how to interpret the definition of a woman in the Equality Act as biological sex. But what it has not done is define the definition of woman in any other context. I have seen a lot of people point out the many problems of both of these events, and I certainly have some rather strong opinions. But I'm going to take a different tack instead. My first reaction to RFK was to make fun of his more absurd comments by sitting on a toilet whilst chucking a ball in the air with one hand and composing a poem with the other. Which, is funny, but it misses the more ominous undertones, and there isn't much that I can add to the direct commentary which hasn't already been said. Likewise, plenty of people have pointed, including Dawn Butler, have pointed out the incredible irony in insisting on biology in toilets and other gendered spaces. So today I am going to discuss how trans people and autistic people are interconnected, and why RFK saying that autism is an epidemic and the biological determinism now being embraced by the UK establishment are two sides of the same coin. Autistic people have a complex view of change. As a rule, we hate it. However, we don't conform to social norms in the same way as a neurotypical person. So while we may be reluctant to interrupt a routine or try something new, we also have the ability to see through societal structures and see the fluidity, arbitrariness, and artificial nature of what appear to others to be bedrock ideas about human behaviour. So we will question everything, including capitalism, monogamy, heteronormativity, the dominant religion. I could go on for a while. This doesn't mean that we're all pagan, queer, polyamorous socialists, rather boring, broadly heterosexual, liberal, agnostic, and autistic people exist in all areas of society. What it does mean is that we are far less likely to allow socially constructed concepts to restrain us from being authentic or to box us in. Gender is one of the most socially constructed concepts we have. The roles of men and women, how they are meant to act, from character traits to the way we dress and cut our hair, are tied to gender, even if the actual traits that are ascribed to different genders move back and forth over time. High heels and wigs and makeup and stockings were all normal male clothing in the 17th and 18th centuries. I remember when I was in primary school, I had really long hair because I hated getting it cut. It was a sensory issue and also about control and trust. And there was an amount of teasing about this being called a girl, especially after the vicar at the church linked to the school called me a girl after I answered this question. After this happened, where my mum was picking me up, I told her about this. She said that it was because I had long hair and so I should cut it to look like a boy. And I said something along the lines of, well, if everyone's calling me a girl, maybe I am. This was about 15 years ago. To which she sort of panicked and was incredibly adamant that I was in fact a boy and I shouldn't question it. To me, the identity of gender at the time wasn't fixed, or at least I didn't think it was more important than not having to cut my hair. I'm not trans or non-binary. I'm telling you this to make it clear that the basic questioning of gendered roles is something that is normal for an autistic person. The roles that are associated with gender, like caregiver or provider, are changing, but are still ingrained in most societies around the world and reinforced in law. In most countries, a man cannot stay home and look after the kids because it simply isn't economically feasible, as maternity pay is widely available around the world, whereas paternity, where it does exist, is usually in weeks rather than months or years. This and other societal structures are incredibly narrow and constricting. Us autistic people tend to be a tad rebellious against authoritative rules that don't seem to exist for any good reason, and may very well reject the gender roles that are attached to our biological sex. This might go some way in explaining why across the world there is a far larger proportion of autistic trans people than there are neurotypical trans people. And I think it is a decent hypothesis that because of how we view gender norms, it is far more likely that an autistic person will realise that they are trans or reject the whole concept of gender altogether and identify as non binary. And when I say across the world, I mean it. In 2018, a Dutch study found that 15% of AFAB autistic people identified as trans or non-binary. This is compared to 3.2% of the Dutch AFAB population as a whole. In Britain, Wearatel 2021 found that 12.6% of autistic participants were trans, compared with 2% of the general population. Again, in 2018, autistic adolescents and adults in the US were asked whether they wished to be the opposite gender. The results were that autistic adolescents were more than twice as likely to agree, and autistic adults were almost 2.5 times as likely to agree. Now, this doesn't mean that there are more autistic trans people than neurotypical. Autistic people are just under 3% of the general population. However, a survey of trans youth in Australia found that 22.5% of trans adolescents were diagnosed autistic people, compared to the general Australian population of 2.5%. This is important to keep in mind when we consider some of the stuff the Queen of the Turf's J.K. Rowling has said regarding autism and trans people later. So the point we have established is that there is a strong Venn diagram shaped link between trans people and autistic people. Now we're going to look at how the backlash against autistic and trans people is interconnected. In his PhD thesis, Toby Atkinson describes the conversation around the overlap between autism and trans people as a moral panic, in which autistic people are portrayed in infantilizing terms, autistic youth as the passive victims of harmful gender ideologies and manipulative activists. The effect of this is that autistic self-advocacy is being suppressed by TERF parents, teachers and doctors that have been consumed by the panic. This method of infantilizing autistic people in order to attack trans people has been adopted by the far-right and feminists alike, and Lily Alexandra has made a wonderful video on how TERFs have aligned with neo-fascists in recent years, and I highly recommend it, and I've taken a few things from it as well. Perhaps the most well-known example of this is J.K. Rowling's initial transphobic debut in 2020, where she suggested that autistic girls were hugely overrepresented in the number of people wanting to be trans men. A statement that seems to be an attempt to dismiss the existence of trans men, who she then tries to explain away as a product of patriarchy and internalized misogyny. Now, this phenomenon predates Rowling. Articles found in the Mail on Sunday in 2018 quite literally say, and I will quote here, that autistic children who are not transgender are being exploited by the transgender lobby. They are being brainwashed. Atkinson points out here that through a variety of media, a common narrative has developed that either suggests that medical professionals are being negligent or manipulative, and that young autistic people are being misdiagnosed with gender dysphoria. Autistic children are not only portrayed as individually at risk, but their apparent susceptibility to abnormal ideas and practices regarding gender is depicted as posing wider problems for society. Atkinson also points out that this type of moral panic has also existed within the framing of autism as an epidemic. As the diagnostic criteria has been refined and expanded, to acknowledge things like girls can also be autistic, obviously the number of people being diagnosed over the last 30 years has increased significantly. But because of Andrew Wakefield's myth that the MMR vaccine causes autism and the perception of autism as a medical disorder and a tragedy, especially in the US where it's been compared to cancer and AIDS, means that a narrative has developed about protecting children from vaccines and autism. This has led to some horrific consequences this year. Children have died in Texas from measles in the largest outbreak since the 1990s, which was entirely preventable because their parents didn't think the vaccines were safe, and the parents are still anti-vaccination after their children have died. Right at the centre of this is the Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert Kennedy Jr., who publicly said that autism comes from vaccines on Fox News in 2023. Perhaps because of the Texas measles outbreak, Kennedy has backed away from claiming that vaccines cause autism and has moved on to this great campaign to discover the environmental cause of a genetic condition, which will supposedly be completed in September. The top US vaccine official, Peter Marks, resigned because of how uncredible this goal is, but even he gave his reasoning on the grounds that RFK is providing false hope, seemingly to compare autism to leukemia. But that is how The Guardian reports his remarks. When you look at the question posed by the interviewer on Face the Nation and how he responds,
particularly the MMR vaccine. You know where I'm going next, the allegations of that specific vaccine and links to autism. Many parents probably know ASD diagnosis rates are on the increase in this country. The CDC says the current numbers are 1 in 36 American children. This is a very broad spectrum of neurodevelopmental disorders. There's no established cause. But yesterday, on Thursday, the HHS Secretary Kennedy said he's got hundreds of scientists from around the world working on it, and he promised this.
By September, we will know what has caused the autism epidemic, and we'll be able to eliminate those exposures.
That gives tremendous hope to a lot of people. Do you know anything about that ongoing research?
You can see really clearly the moral panic that Atkinson was writing about in 2021, both in the Face the Nation host, who really doesn't understand the issue, and in the Guardian's headline and opening paragraphs, which re-emphasise false hope before getting to the substance. The way that autism is portrayed really does come down to sensationalism in the media, the same as it does with trans people. In the US, a number of states, in an effort to restrict trans people, as well as passing laws banning gender-affirming care for people under a certain age, have also passed laws specifically targeting autistic trans people. In 2023, the Attorney General of Missouri implemented emergency regulations which forbid medical practitioners from providing gender-affirming care to a person unless they had been screened for autism. Now, not only does this delegitimize the lived experience of trans autistic people, but considering the difficulties in getting an autism diagnosis as an adult anywhere, but especially in the US where they aren't covered under health insurance, this also provides a significant barrier to medical care for trans people of all ages and neurotypes. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network points out that while this is not a ban on autistic people getting healthcare, the stigma and moral panic which we've discussed means that many hospitals may be worried about being sued and choose not to provide procedures to autistic trans people. In Georgia, the Senate passed a law banning gender-affirming care for everyone before the age of 18. In Section 1 of the Act is the line, gender dysphoria is often co-bid with other mental health and developmental conditions, including autism spectrum disorder. Arkansas has had many attempts at banning trans youth access to healthcare, some of which have been overturned in the federal courts. Nevertheless, a bill was passed in 2023 which provided an exception to doctors that they would not be sued if they could prove that the person they were providing gender-affirming care to did not have autism, depression, ADHD, an eating disorder, an intellectual disability, or a psychotic disorder. This makes it incredibly unlikely that neurodivergent or mentally ill people will be able to access gender-affirming care. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network has pointed out that policies like these create stigma around the idea that autistic people are too disabled to understand the decision that they are making. The attack that we see in the US has now bled through to influence British policy. The Cass Review report borrows from this idea that autistic people are not capable of understanding their own sexuality or gender identity. Alexithymia is a common trait of autistic people, but not exclusive to them, where someone might find it difficult to identify and describe their emotions. The Cass Review expanded the definition of alexithymia to gender identity and sexuality is overly simplistic, misleading, and infantilizing. The heavy implication of the review is that autistic teenage girls, but biological teenage girls, in particular, may not be trans, and that girls who weren't autistic were emotionally unstable, and this just removes their agency. The Cass Review has been broadly criticised by institutions such as Amnesty International and the Yale Law School. One point of contention is its views on puberty blockers, which it is rather sceptical of. Among other arguments, it dismisses the ideas that puberty blockers provide time to think, as most people who start puberty blockers end up taking HRT. The irony is that this is something that our trans-skeptic society insists upon as a safeguard. Nevertheless, the report has been taken seriously by both Sunak and Starmer's government, who have removed puberty blockers as a treatment for gender dysphoria, for new patients anyway, claiming that they are a risk to health. However, they have kept puberty blockers available for paediatric medicine for a wide array of other treatments, including endometritis and fertility preservation before chemo, which means that everyone else can access these medications apart from trans kids with a couple of exceptions for clinical studies. In the UK, the banning of puberty blockers means that, similar to many Republican states in the US, that many trans kids, and by extension trans autistic kids, will be forced to go through puberty in a different way to their gender identity, which will lead to increased gender dysphoria. And as we've discussed previously, with autistic people, gender dysphoria can lead to burnout. The point I need to underline here is that untreated gender dysphoria is really dangerous. The suicide rate is different everywhere, but everywhere it is astronomical. Half of all transgender people in Australia have attempted suicide at least once. 48% of all young trans people in England have attempted. India is lower at 31%, but half of that 31% have attempted before their 20th birthday. And in the US, the rate is 41%, lower and higher in some states than others, but higher amongst young people. Despite the incredibly poor mental health of the trans community in the US, since being in office, RFK Jr. has enacted a number of anti-trans and anti-intersex policies from Trump's executive orders. Citing biological truth, Kennedy issued guidance recognizing only two sexes, implementing a very narrow and frankly laughable policy of only recognizing a man and a woman, not only denying the existence of intersex people, which are people with indeterminate genitalia, but also non-binary people. Their definition of man and woman relies entirely on the ability to reproduce and create sperm or eggs, with obvious problems like are post-menopausal women no longer women? If a man had testicular cancer or even a vasectomy, are they no longer a man by this definition? The line in the official guidance from HHS is that recognizing the immutable and biological nature of sex is essential to ensure the protection of women's health, safety, private spaces, and sports and opportunities. Not surprising, this is the same type of argument deployed in the UK Supreme Court case in the written submission by Sex Matters. They argue that Parliament's intention when writing the Equality Act must have been to define a woman by biological sex, because they wrote exceptions into the law that trans people could be excluded from gendered spaces under certain circumstances. They highlight examples of rape crisis services, where they argue both trans men and trans women should be excluded. They then extend their argument that trans kids shouldn't be allowed in single-sex schools or be allowed to compete in sports. I would like to re-emphasise at this point that the British Supreme Court doesn't have the power to create law like they do in the US and can only interpret statutes like the Equality Act of 2010. The court seemed rather uncomfortable about the implications of the ruling. They acknowledge the vulnerability of the trans community and are keen to repeatedly underline the protections given to trans people also exist explicitly in the Equality Act 2010. When having to rely on context from the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 for definition of women, the court was not going to be able to rule that Parliament 50 years ago had a nuanced concept of gender. This ruling has meant that trans people will face discrimination and will be limited in a number of ways. However, the British government, worried about losing votes to socially conservative parties, has pretended that the Supreme Court's ruling goes a lot further than it does. Keir Starmer has completed a U-turn from 2021, where he criticised his own MP Rosie Duffield for her views of defining gender by biology in 2021, where he said, "We need to have a mature and respectful debate about trans rights, and we need to bear in mind that the trans community are amongst the most marginalised and abused communities." Now his government are saying that the ruling made it clear that provisions and services should be accessed on the basis of biological sex, which is not entirely accurate. Former MP Ben Bradshaw said that questions like do trans women need to use men's bathrooms would require further interpretation by the courts. Additionally, as pointed out by Labour MP Dawn Butler, enforcing biology in single-sex spaces has some problems, as I will put here.
Why?
Because the point is that we're saying that people who are biologically men shouldn't be using women's toilets. That's the point of this ruling, among other things.
But a trans man is biologically a woman.
Someone who's transitioned from being a woman to a man is...
And so they would then have to use women's toilets.
Now I want to switch tracks and move back to talking about the common threat that has emerged towards autistic and trans people in the face of this moral panic and backlash, following the greater amount of public visibility of both groups in recent years.
The cost of treating autism in this country by 2035, so within 10 years, will be $1 trillion a year. This is added to already astronomical healthcare costs. This is an individual tragedy as well. Autism destroys families. More importantly, it destroys our greatest resource, which are our children. These are children who should not be suffering like this.
The first item on Robert Kennedy's list of things autistic people can't do is pay taxes. The second thing is hold a job. This isn't just ignorance, misinformation, or fear-mongering, it's deliberate. The picture which he is building is a world in which autistic people do not contribute to society in any way and require large amounts of resources to care for them. In short, he's arguing that we are a drain on society. In the same way, the prominent TERF, Helen Joyce, has also argued that trans people would always require more resources than other people.
Because we have to try to limit the harm. And that means reducing or keeping down the number of people who transition. And that's for two reasons. One of them is that every one of those people is a person who's been damaged. But the second one is every one of those people is basically, a huge problem to a sane world. Like if you've got people, that, whether they're transitioned, whether they're happily transitioned, whether they're unhappily transitioned, whether they're detransitioned, if you've got people who've dissociated from their sex in some way, every one of those people is someone who needs special accommodation in a sane world where we re-acknowledge the truth of sex. And I mean, the people who've been damaged by it, the children who've been put through this, those people deserve every accommodation we can possibly make. But every one of them is a difficulty. I'm saying every one of those people for 50, 60, 70 years is going to need things that the rest of us just don't need because the rest of us are just our sex. So the fewer of those people there are, the better in the sane world that I hope we will reach.
She is arguing that trans people should be kept to the lowest number possible because they take up more resources. But the thing about this is you can make this argument about anyone who requires medication. Would RFK or Helen Joyce get up tomorrow and seriously say these things about an epileptic person who, like Helen Joyce says, will require more medication than the rest of us, or indeed a man who has had testicular cancer and needs testosterone for the rest of his life? Would she see it in the same way? Likewise, I hope that RFK wouldn't say that the life of a person in a wheelchair wasn't worth less because they couldn't play baseball. This is where we not only see that an attack on trans people is an attack on autistic people, and vice versa, but it is also an attack on disabled people more widely. The underlying logic is that your life is only worth what you are able to contribute to society, which sounds an awful lot like the concept of the Volksgemeinschaft to me, and I've covered that up here. When RFK Jr. says that autistic people shouldn't be suffering like this and autism destroys families, when he insists upon creating a database of autistic people collected illegally from their private medical records and other commercially available data in order to understand an environmental factor which doesn't exist, I remind you, autism is genetic and develops in utero. The Trump administration has banned all other autism-related research as part of the DEI ban. The autistic community has begun to fear that the goal of this information is to track us. People inside autistic spaces on the internet are joking and are genuinely worrying that this attempt to cure us will result in an erosion of our human rights and outright eugenics. I've seen autistic people talk about camps, and before you brush this off as an overreaction, let me tell you about David Geyer. David Geyer is the man RFK has put in charge of gathering autistic people's private data and running the study. However, Geyer is not a doctor. In fact, he has been disciplined for practicing medicine without a license, although that's rather euphemistic. Not only did he perpetuate an early form of the vaccine myth, which has been completely disproven as the component he blamed hasn't been used in vaccine for more than 20 years, he also experimented on autistic children, trying to cure them by using a drug that was meant to treat prostate cancer, which induces chemical castration. The man running RFK's study chemically castrated autistic children, which sounds an awful lot like eugenics to me. As I have laid out earlier, the UK has banned certain types of gender-affirming care, and in the US, the Republican Party have consistently tried to limit and block access to trans healthcare. In addition to the autism-related measures in Arkansas, Missouri, and Georgia, over the last 5 years, hundreds of bills have been introduced in state legislatures designed to censor trans people. These range from book bans to bathroom bans to stop trans women from playing sports, and not all of these have passed. However, in North Dakota, Idaho, Oklahoma, Alabama, Florida, and South Carolina, it is a felony for someone to provide provide medical care to trans youth. Every state which voted for Trump in 2020, plus Georgia, has bans on healthcare, except for where the courts have blocked bans, like in Arkansas. In Montana, a ban on gender-affirming care for anyone under 18 was overturned by the state Supreme Court as it breached the right to privacy. Nevertheless, the state's legislature remains incredibly hostile. The only trans representative was censured when she tried to speak against a similar bill denying healthcare to trans people. The reality is that if people don't receive treatment for gender dysphoria, a large proportion of them die, and for 37% of trans children in the US, it is not possible for them to access healthcare, as is often the case that the nearest clinic that can legally help them is several hundred miles away. Whilst there is a large overlap in the Venn diagram which links autistic people to trans people, and both groups are marginalised, what links the UK Supreme Court decision and the policies of RFK Jr. is the strong belief by prominent sections of society that we shouldn't exist, that we take up too many resources, that we don't contribute to society, that we are mentally ill, that we are an existential threat to traditional norms and values. When I was trying to make this video, I was struggling for the right angle, and I was trying to explain the link between autistic and trans people to my dad. And during that conversation, I compared the relationship between us being like Article 5 of NATO, as I was struggling for an effective analogy. An attack on one should be an attack on all. Now, he made quite a bit of fun of this comparison to an old movie, and we laughed about it. But the next explanation which I came up with was an important one. I said to him that Martin Niemöller's poem was missing a few lines, because somewhere between first they came for the communists and I did not speak out because I was not a communist, and the line and then they came for the Jews are the unwritten lines. Then they came for the trans people and I didn't notice, and they came for the disabled people. We spoke out. They killed them anyway. So when I was recording this video, I hadn't figured out what on earth my conclusion would be. And that's because the stuff I'm talking about can get very depressing. And honestly, I try not to be. I try to be hopeful and lovely and calm. But, things aren't great. And it's easier sometimes to talk about the negative sides of these things because the things are important and it matters. But I think what I should say to you is that the real important message is the interconnectedness between different groups of people, and our shared connection is the important thing that should matter. And I hope you guys have found my video informative. I hope you haven't too depressing either. And I wish you a merry good day, my friends. Goodbye.